3, Activity 2A, Historical Maps Presentation. For this activity, as well as Week 4, Activity 1A, we will be working with historical maps. Now, historical maps are a bit of a challenge for Appalachian State University. By that I mean, for our interests at the end of the semester, for our last project of doing historical landscape reconstruction, our campus is, surprisingly, lacking in historical map. There is a reason for that, and we will get to talking about that reason at the end of the first part of this presentation. But the first part of today's presentation is going to look at sources for reconstructing past landscapes, mostly cartographic or map-based sources. However, there are other archival materials, records, and documents that we can use to interpret past landscapes. So that's what I want to go over for this first part of the presentation. The second part of the presentation, we're going to jump over to the ASU Library's website, visit Special Collections virtually, and take a look at one of the digital collections, the ASU Historical Maps Collection, and laugh at how sad it is. And I will, of course, explain to you why it is so sad. We can rely on a number of sources for reconstructing past landscapes other than only maps. A wide range of archival materials can give us information about what an area looked like, what the landscape, the topography, property ownership, and what people thought about the landscape, what we call their landscape discourses, when they talk about their surroundings, looked like based on a variety of archival sources. But each of these archival sources that are not maps require unique and creative means of interpreting what that landscape looked like. Not to say that maps don't also require creativity and critical thinking to interpret what is being represented, but we'll get to that in a moment. One of the first and most common sources we can turn to in archives for reconstructing past landscapes are texts. Now, we do make a distinction between texts and records. We'll get to what that difference is. Letters, diaries, travel narratives. Each of these is a written account from someone to some particular audience, even if in the case of a diary it is an audience of themselves. Each of these is a narrative form that may on occasion describe surroundings. It may describe where someone has visited. If it's a diary, it may contain an individual's regular engagement, their embodied engagement with their surroundings, such as, for instance, a 19th century farmer's diary that regularly talks about their crops and planting and harvest and their cows and their pasturage and cutting wood for building materials or for fuel. Travel narratives, of course, often tend to have more attention to landscape and locations and mention place names and roads and other transportation corridors. There's also a form of literature from the 19th and early 20th centuries, at least as far as I'm often engaging it, that consists of material designed for public consumption, often produced by business associations, merchants associations, tourism or travel bureaus, that basically talks up what a community or region or part of the state offers to investors, to new businesses, to new potential residents. This town boosterist literature will cast the community often in glowing terms, but will talk about what a community offers, what businesses are in a particular town or in a county or so forth. And all of these give us ways to read about what people in the past said about their landscape. On the other hand, we can turn from narrative archival materials to data-based archival materials, or records. These are a little bit harder to make inferences from, but these inferences are still possible. Tax records, for instance, will give us a couple of things for reconstructing a past landscape. First, tax records will often be listed. The residents of a community will often be listed in a tax record by where they lived. And sometimes you can just look down that list of tax record returns and see the order in which the tax assessor moved through the community. And often that is a very regular, very consistent, year to year to year process of recording these properties and the taxes that are owed on these properties. Also, tax records will not only mention the name of the property owner, the party responsible for paying the tax, as well as property address, and if not certainly a house number, then certainly such and such road. Tax records will often also include the acreage of a particular property, as well as estimates of how much value a property owner invested in improving the property. So that can give us a sense of, they might have not had much on this property because there's not much tax being collected on a particular property. Whereas a large brick house and a fine barn and other outbuildings would certainly increase the property value. Now, what those looked like, where they were, how many outbuildings, how grand of a house, we could only be left to wonder from tax records. But we can tell that there would be a difference between an unimproved forested lot of 10 acres versus an improved lot of 10 acres that may have a grand house and other outbuildings. Town council minutes will record the legal activities of a community, the ordinances. By legal activities, I mean the ordinances that a community approves. Often these ordinances have spatial qualities, such as an ordinance to mandate the installation of sidewalks on a particular street, or the opening of a particular street. Court records, lawsuits are a wonderful resource for understanding properties. If someone enters into a lawsuit with their neighbor over the boundary of their property, for instance, often that record of the lawsuit will mention details of their and their neighbors' properties. Court records might also be a matter of probates or wills and the way that a particular property was being divided between the deceased member of the family and their inheritors. Census records are also a wonderful resource. Sometimes in class, in the before time, we would dedicate a day to working with census records to come up with community profiles, because census records would tell you not only one, where people lived, because if you looked at a census record, basically the census taker would move just like today, house by house, street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood. And those records would show house number one, structure number one, household number one. Then they move to another structure, or structure number two, household number two. But if they got to a structure that had multiple households living in it, say an apartment complex or a duplex, it would say structure number 10, household number 1. And then the next line of the census would be structure number 10, household number 2. So there was that spatial quality to just the recording and listing of censuses. Also, census information would give us the name of the head of the household, the members of their household, their ages, where they were born by state, or whether they were a foreign immigrant, they were born in England or Italy, Ireland, Japan. That would be listed on the census. Depending on the census decade, their occupation and whether they were literate, and their race would all be listed as well. One of the cool things that we used to see in the census records for Watauga County when looking at Boone in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were some inferences we could make about what the town's landscape looked like from what occupations people had on the census. There's another thing too, but from looking at their occupations, you could see railroad employees in the 1890s, 1900. You could also see wagons rights, guys that made wagons. And then suddenly by 1910, 1920, 1930, there was just a massive explosion of gas stations and car repair shops and mechanics, auto mechanics. Just a ridiculous number versus the total population of Boone, almost as if everybody in town had a car. when in fact it may have been that Boone, as the county seat, simply became the best location in the whole of Watauga County, including Blowing Rock and Vilas and Vallecrucis, to go if you were going to buy a car and if you needed to get your car repaired. The other thing we could see in the census, again, from the way that the census moved spatially, the census taker moved spatially, was you could see basically the racial divisions of Boone. You could end up going through the census and everybody's white, it's all white, it's all white, it's all white, and then suddenly a bunch of B, or M for mulatto, mixed race. And suddenly you'd see this just page worth of African American households. And then you'd find a bunch of white. You would very much so in Boone and many small southern towns and large southern towns and northern towns basically see this racial division showing up in the census records. And then, of course, deeds. Now, deeds are tricky. You'd think that a property deed would tell you a lot about the property in question. But the fact of the matter is, deeds are only concerned with the boundaries of a parcel. Where those boundaries are, where those boundaries run, what angle and distance they run, and what their total acreage is. It is very, very infrequent that we find references to buildings in a property deed. Now, we may find, if you're interested in environmental history, we may find references to the type of ground cover on a particular parcel. I've been doing a lot of this work in New Jersey on the Delaware Bay Shore, looking at salt marshes and the development of salt marsh environments in southern New Jersey in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And there, often the types of land you held along the Bay Shore, if it was arable upland that was good for farming, moderately good for farming, it was very sandy soil, or if it was salt marsh, or if it was forest, those types of land would often be referenced in property deeds. But buildings, homes, outbuildings, not very often referenced. And in fact, the boundaries themselves are in the 18th and 19th and even into the 20th century very frustrating, because those boundaries are often laid out as proceeding from a large white oak tree at the boundary corner with Water Street. Okay, well, we got Water Street, but what oak tree are you talking about? Well, it's the oak tree that then the property boundary proceeds north-northeast 35 degrees, 15 minutes, for 3 rods and 4 links. Yeah, special boundary measures as well. So, property boundaries and the acreage of a lot are what is most concerning in the property deeds, but not any mention of particular buildings. Also, of course, historical photographs, but that was Week 3 Activity 1A and 1B, so you know all about that already. And, as you also know from Week 3 Activity 1A's video, historical postcards. Although, to be fair, I'm not exactly sure where the giant potato was located in Kutztown, Pennsylvania. But maps. Now, as I said before, we can't simply say that the most accurate way to reconstruct a past landscape is through historical maps. When we see a historical map, such as the map featured here, you all recognize it, right? It's your home state. It's North Carolina. Actually, North Carolina, South Carolina. And if you look, the Appalachian Mountains, you're somewhere over here. If you look at the angle that the state is portrayed at, it's from the coast. It's a coastal navigation map from the late 1600s. However, whenever looking at a map, we have to think of its purpose, such as in this case, a 17th century coastal navigation map, its accuracy, and there's several issues there we need to address, and also what is included or excluded on the map. Now, the purpose of a map is simply, why was the map drawn? In this case, we are looking at a map that was drawn to assist 17th century navigation of the Carolina coast. Was it accurate? No. Accuracy can be affected by a number of factors. First, the cartographer's information. What is a cartographer drawing their map based on? Are they drawing their map based on a survey the cartographer, him or herself, actually completed? Or are they drawing their map based upon information from other sources? In the case of this 17th century coastal navigation map, while the coastal components may be as accurate as possible for the cartographer, and we'll talk about techniques and technology that could affect accuracy given a particular time frame, the other bits of information you see on this map, rivers, forest locations, mountain locations, are all based on other sources of information for this cartographer and thus show a questionable degree of accuracy. Now, when we're talking about accuracy, I should note that we are talking about the degree to which a map aligns with the physical, on-the-ground reality of the Earth or the area at the time that the cartographer was drafting this map. Accuracy in terms of geospatial location generally, over time, improved with the development of new survey techniques and new awareness of the shape of the Earth. We won't go into detail on that. That's something kind of neat to talk about, geoids and geodesic measurements, but we can save that for another day, and probably not this class. Maybe if ever I teach a class on Intro to GIS, that would be several weeks of a class to begin with. Alright, so accuracy depends on the cartographer's sources, the survey technique that was used to prepare the data from which the map was drawn, as well as the time period and the technology used to inform some of the fundamental concepts of map making and cartographic or geographic survey, rather. Inclusion and accuracy can simply be related to the purpose of the map, and it can also reflect biases. In terms of the purpose of a map, if a map is drawn to indicate political boundaries, that map may include towns, cities, capitals, and obviously political boundaries, say at the municipal level, county level, state level, and so forth. That same map may not pay much attention to topography. On the other hand, a topographical map may focus on topography to the exclusion of political boundaries. So that's the basic way the purpose of a map can affect what is included or excluded from its presentation of the land. However, we can also see biases in a map. So for instance, if you're looking at a map of a 19th century urban area anywhere in the United States or Europe or elsewhere in the world, you may not see as much attention to detail in areas that are impoverished, in areas that are slums, in areas that are minority communities. Those communities may completely disappear from the map. So those are our issues with looking at maps: purpose, accuracy, inclusion, exclusion. Now let's look at some of the common types of maps that we can find for late 19th and early 20th centuries in the United States, which, thinking about Boone and the founding of Appalachian State University, this is our time frame. Map books, or atlas books, were a popular form of disseminating or sharing maps with the general public. One company in particular, the F.W. Beers Company, the purpose of these atlases were all to share with the public maps of a particular state, sometimes maps of a particular county. And in each atlas, the nice thing about these atlases would be that they would show at the state or county level road networks and towns, little communities, little agricultural settlements here and there. And then they would be embellished with excerpts that showed particular towns or areas of towns with pretty nice detail, showing house locations, country roads that weren't really county-maintained roads, private roads, and the house locations would often, as you can see on the bottom right image, Identify the owner of the property at the time that the map was made. Also, throughout these atlases, they were decorative. They would include a fair number of lithographic images, sketch images of communities, often biased towards wealthier homes and estates, but definitely including sketch images of communities portrayed on the maps. Here's another couple examples from 19th century, late 19th century atlases. You can see on the left, the top left, there's an excerpt for Brandywine Village that shows the layout of streets and houses and stores and industrial sites. On the bottom left corner, we zoom in a little bit and we get to see a cemetery. We get to see a house now that's probably this right here, a bank, possibly some kind of main street, a bowling alley. And so it's a helpful thing to try to reconstruct past landscapes when someone has gone through the trouble of identifying the structures and street layouts and property ownership for you. Now, another type of cool map that was popular in the 19th century were bird's eye view maps. Bird's eye view maps are called bird's eye view because they were drawn as if you were a bird flying over a particular town, or you were sitting up in a balloon. In fact, there used to be an old rumor that the maps were drawn by someone in a balloon, and that's not true. In fact, the maps were often drawn by someone proceeding up and down the streets of a community, making cartographic notes, sketching out and surveying the town, and then drawing the map later with a creative eye to how this would look from the air. Now, of note, these maps were often produced as part of that booster literature. Remember I told you earlier in the presentation about booster literature that would promote a community, often produced by a town's merchants association or chamber of commerce? Yeah, and that's the case here. The map in the background of this image, it's the map, the map, the map. The map in the background of this image of the town of Vineland, New Jersey, was sponsored, paid for, by the Vineland Merchants Association. And so therefore all the lithographic sketches are sketches of the businesses the members of the Vineland Merchants Association. And the sketch map in the center, the core map for this bird's eye view map, shows the community of Vineland, New Jersey sometime in the early 1870s. And the neat thing about this, let's take a look more clearly about the map itself, is if we blow it up, and if we were to go out and actually measure these blocks and the buildings that are still standing, like this Methodist church right here, or this Baptist church right here, they are in really surprisingly accurate positions. For instance, the park up here, this area here was a public park that had a pavilion built for a religious revival, a national camp meeting in July of 1867. June 1867. I only wrote a book about it. But anyway, this pavilion right here was quite literally where the pavilion was located. Also, we have a type of map that we're going to spend time next week. Week 4, Activity 1B, is going to be using a Sanborn insurance map. And I'm going to save my spiel about Sanborn insurance maps for the brief video that I'll record for next week, Week 4, Activity 1A. Sanborn insurance maps were produced for many towns and cities across the United States in the late 19th century, beginning in the early 1880s, and are fantastic resources if you are studying one of these towns that has a Sanborn map coverage. The maps themselves depicted buildings, had the buildings by color coding, whether they were wood or brick or some other building material, identified houses from stores, stores from industrial properties, and sometimes listed the name of a business or the name of a company that was running a factory in the community. We'll talk more about Sanborn maps next week because The Sanborn Insurance Map for Boone in 1947 is the oldest map we have of campus. And there's a reason. Let's switch over to the Belk Library website. We're going to take a visit to the digital collections and special collections and take a look at the ASU Historical Maps collection. To get to special collections, we go from library.appstate.edu over to special collections. Here we are on collections.library.appstate.edu, and we want the digital collections. So we click the horse, whatever it is, it's labeled here, it's digital collections. We click that, and then once we're here, we're on a landing page for the digital collections. We're not yet able to browse them. What we get to see is a list of recently added items. To go to the collections, we have to go up here, click collections. And as you can see, there are 42 total digital collections. Folk songs, the old Appalachian Consortium Press publications, land ownership survey records, oral history project interviews. We go down, annual reports from the university, 1961 to 2010, and then Appalachian State University campus maps. This is the collection we want. By the way, if you've forgotten, you click next page down here, and right here is the Appalachian State University Historical Photos collection. But we want, back on this page, the Appalachian State University campus maps. So we click this, and as you can see, this collection contains campus guides with detailed maps of Appalachian State University. 2 maps have dates on them, 1994 and 1991. Other maps do not have dates on them. And as you can see, there are not very many. 9 maps in the digital collections. I can tell you the physical collections in closed stacks are not much better. I think all told, between the digital maps collection and the physical maps in the closed stacks of the Special Collections Library, we have less than 20. Well, less than 20 maps. And only one of the maps in the closed stacks is older than 1950. Why is that the case? Well, basically, in the 1920s, we built a second administration building, a new administration building. The second administration building housed the university archives and university building records and university business records. And then, one night in 1967, that second administration building burned to the ground and took with it building records, maps. So it's frustrating. We are lacking specific spatial knowledge of our campus via maps before the 1960s. And that one map I mentioned that was from the 1950s is actually a memory map, a highly, highly inaccurate memory map that was drafted by an alumni who was a student at App State in the 1930s. Thus, why our last project of the semester is a landscape reconstruction project, because honestly, no one knows where some of these early buildings were located. Week 3, Activity 2B, is that I'd like you to try to take a look at some historical maps. And the maps in question are all available on the David Rumsey Historical Map Collection at Stanford University. It hosts thousands of maps from all around the world. To search the collection of the David Rumsey Map Collection, go to www.davidrumsey.com. You can see the site in the URL bar right here. When you get to the site itself, to search the collection, you click here on the top right corner. And let's say we want to find maps of North Carolina. We search, new tab appears in our browser, and I want to show you how to navigate this site before I show you today's worksheet. Over on the left are ways to filter or limit your search results. As you can see, search results with fields similar to North and Carolina combined, 1,098. We do North Carolina in quotes in the search bar, we can cut that down. Notice it's kind of like app search. It's simple, stupid. Here we're having results for North Carolina as a search term, and that cuts our results down to 768. We can then filter those results by, first, what type of map are we looking for? A world atlas, an atlas map, a text page, a data visualization, a city atlas, or other features. We're not going to worry about this. We can limit our search to specific states. So for instance, you're looking at this going, well, wait, there's North Carolina 271 maps and South Carolina 132, United States 91. What's going on? Basically, this means that there are 271 maps that are primarily tagged as North Carolina. There are then 132 maps that are primarily tagged as South Carolina that also show North Carolina. We will be focused on maps that are primarily tagged North Carolina. Or we can filter by the publisher or known cartographer of a particular map. And we can also filter by year. Notice the years listed here are years for which we have the most maps. However, if you want to see all of the years, and this will matter for a question that I ask you in the activity, we can click More, and that will expand that and show us chronologically arranged what maps do we have for North Carolina, or South Carolina that shows North Carolina, or Georgia or the Southeast that shows North Carolina. If we want to be very specific, we can click North Carolina as where, and then, as you can see, there are 271 maps right here. And then, if we expand to when and click More under When, it can show us all of the maps that are primary tagged as North Carolina. All right? So the activity, week 3, activity 2B, asks you to do the following using the David Rumsey map collection. First, when does Boone or any Watauga County community first appear on a published map in the David Rumsey map collection? So you're going to have to start early. Honestly, I would recommend thinking late 1700s, early 1800s. 2, what is the earliest map in the collection depicting the North Carolina high country? So think 1600s, early 1700s. 3, open any map in the collection between 1760 and 1800. I recommend the 1776 Sayer and Bennett map of North Carolina. Look at the state's northwestern area and identify one city or town your group recognizes as still standing even today from that 1770, 1760 to 1800 time frame. And then finally, open a specific map, a 1839 Burr map of the Carolinas. Looking in the western mountains of North Carolina, in what county does the town Council's Store appear? So you're looking for one particular town called Council's Store and trying to figure out in what county was that town located. So that's the activity. That's the presentation. Talk to you next time.